So Google defines design tokens as small reusable design decisions that make up a design system's visual style. But what does that even mean? So let's go ahead and look at the different types of tokens that we need and how to set them up to build your design system correctly. And come join the discussion and the community on uicollective.co. Or if you need help with your design system, from coded components to design system components, come work with me and the team. Let's start off by looking at what are the types of colors that we need in terms of our design tokens to start. So in the case of this snack bar here, and again, this can be for a button, and this can be for any type of component, you're always going to need a success state. So in terms of your success state, generally green, you're going to need an icon success for icons that are in that success state, text success, border success, so the border around that successful element, and then a surface success. So we're not getting into border width and border radius just yet. That's going to come a little bit later on. So just from this one simple component, we need 4 design tokens, all specific to our success. That goes to be the same with information as well. And this is why consistency in naming is super important. So you notice how the information, the start slug of the design token is the same. So it's always icon, it's surface, it's text, it's border. And it's only what follows after that changes. But even if these are all the same component, they're still using that same naming convention. So information. And that avoids a lot of, what can I say, confusion. When designers are working with your design system, oftentimes they might not know if the naming is different. They might not know the specific token to apply to components or to apply in their designs. So very similar to success, what I've done, just swap the color for blue, and all of a sudden these are our information design tokens. Let's keep moving on. Next, we have our warning. So we've already covered if something was successful. We've already covered our information. So if we need to be alerted of something, maybe there's a system update happening. Now I need to get a warning for this. So like maybe I entered in a field wrong. Maybe the system's about to go down. I don't know, something like that. But again, everything is simply warning. So you have your icon warning, your surface warning, your text warning, and then your border warning, keeping that same consistency in terms of naming convention across the design token. Let's then lastly look at error before we move into some of the more complex elements. Error, exactly the same. You have your icon error, your surface error, your text error, and then your border error. And these are all going to be design tokens that are going to go into your mapped collection that we're going to look at very shortly. So I'm going to pause the video right here before we start looking at some of the other components. And next, let's look at some of our other text design tokens, border design tokens, so on and so forth. And this is specific to buttons, but this can really play into any really clickable component. So in the case of the UI Collective brand, like our main colors is purple here. So say if this is here's our primary button, so the button that's on all our websites, on everything that we're doing, there's some different variants that go into this. So you have a border action, a surface action, an icon on action, and then text on action. Now, there's some differences here. Your action color tends to be your primary brand color, the color of your buttons, because it's an action element. But if a text or icon is sitting on those action colors, they're on action. They're not action. Because action would be in the case of, like a text action, it would be the same color as this button, because these are actionable elements. So there's always a lot of confusion in terms of action on action. So just think of action is the color of your action elements, and on action is the color of the text and the icons that are on that action element. So refresh with this button. So you have our border action. Now, border and surface, they're the same. A lot of designers tend to lead out their border, but I always like to leave it in just in case I do need to make that change with the border in the future. So we have a border action. We have our surface action. Again, the color of our action elements. And then we have our text on action, which in this case is white. And then we have our icon on action as well. So that's our button. But what about if that hover is in like a hover? What if that button, is in a hover state? So very similar. So our border action hover is going to change. Our border action is going to change to border action hover. Our surface action is going to change to surface action hover because those actionable colors are now being hovered. But our text on action and icon on action can stay the same. If they're the exact same color, they don't always need to have an action hover design token associated with it. You can if you want to. And I have another example as to what that might look like. where if the text on the inside does change on hover, you're of course going to have a border action hover, a surface action hover, and then you're going to have an icon on action hover, and then a text on action hover. So there's a couple different examples there in terms of different states for your buttons and the different types of design tokens that would go into that. I do know this can be pretty confusing. So if you have any questions related to this, just feel free to leave some comments below or on our community forum and I'll get back to you. But let's keep moving forward. Okay, so I decided to put disabled inside of its own section because they're a little bit different than our action and our action hover. Because there can be a button on the page that's disabled, and I can be on that page that represents that button. And because I can't click that button because I'm on the page, that is then on disabled. So a little bit different. And this is why design tokens can be so confusing sometimes. So what I have here are two different disabled buttons. So I have a disabled button. So what you can do is picture maybe I'm on a page and navigation to another page is disabled. This would be the case of this disabled button right here. But let's say that I'm on that page. And because I'm on that page, that button isn't clickable, so it's on disabled. I am on that element that this button is referring to, so it's disabled. I know that can be pretty confusing. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. So in terms of our initial disabled button, we're going to have a border disabled, a surface disabled, an icon on disabled, and a text on disabled. Because again, our icons and our text are on the disabled element. Then if we switch over to the on disabled, so the color of their border and our surface has changed very slightly, and our text and icon can also change very slightly as well, maybe to signify that I'm already on that page that this button would lead to. So we would then have a border on disabled, a surface on disabled, an icon on disabled, and a text on disabled. Now, in terms of your disabled elements, I've worked with a whole lot of variations in the past, and designers like to work with their own variations of what makes most sense for them. So in terms of freedom or leeway in structuring your disabled design tokens in the way that makes most sense for you, I would highly encourage it. But this right here is what I found works really well with the design system clients that we work with. Okay, so let's now look at some common surface design tokens, starting off with your surface page. So your surface page is, you guessed it, the color of all your pages. This is one that designers tend to overlook, but I think it's super underrated because let's say all your pages should have like this slight shade of gray as a background. What's going to end up happening if you don't have a surface page design token is designers are just going to eyeball it. They're just going to try to get as close to and say, it looks close enough. That's going to be my page background because my developers will just fix it. What's then going to end up happening is you're going to have pages in your website or application that all have very slightly different background colors. So you absolutely want to avoid that. So always have a surface page. For all of your other components, main components, and a great example of this is a top navigation, you might want to offer some differentiation between your page and those elements, but they might also want to be the same as well. But regardless if they're the same or if they're different, it should have its own design token. In this case, surface primary. So I have my top navigation here. I might have a side navigation or other widgets on this page. Those can be have a surface primary design token applied to them to offer some differentiation between the page. But again, your surface primary and page do not need to be different colors. They can also be the exact same hex codes. Now, I do realize that if your page is white, your primary is white, you're going to want to have some colors, whether it's a dashboard or a website for widgets, cards, modals, whatever. And this is where you might want to introduce a surface secondary, which is maybe just a very slight shade of gray or other colors that your cards should be. Now, this is where documentation is super important. So designers know when to apply a surface primary versus a surface secondary. If all of the cards on your website should have this light background of gray here, you don't all of a sudden want to see your application in development and they all have the white backgrounds, which would be used for things like top and side navigations. So in terms of your surfaces, so your primaries, your secondary colors, this is where documentation for your design system, so your designers always know what design token to apply, is key. Okay, so one thing I would like to call out is we always also do need a border primary. And still in this example where we have a color of our page and a color of our component, so your surface page and your surface primary, oftentimes you're going to want some level of differentiation on your cards, your widgets, your components. that separate out those components or those surface primaries from the page itself. This is what's called our border primary. Generally what's pretty popular these days is for your border primary just to be a really subtle shade of gray, just to offer enough differentiation between the color of the background and the color of other components. So that's what's known as our border primary. Now, you can also have border secondaries and border tertiaries as well. However, those are less common. But again, you're always going to need a border primary for some of your components to offer some of that differentiation. New with UI Collective Plus is an easy way to organize your design task and also manage your design team. I'll put a link for that in the description. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and look at fonts. So in terms of your fonts, there's a ton of different design tokens that go into them. Your font size, your font color, your font weight, your font style, your line height, your paragraph spacing. So we're going to get to all that stuff a little bit later on in this episode, but let's just cover the different types of H tags, paragraph tags that we're going to need in general. So I actually always like to have a hero. I know I've left this out from past lessons, where if I do need some text on a hero banner that's larger than an H1, I do like to have a hero just to keep that in my back pocket if I do need to go above that H1, although it is less common. And that is more, a common use case for marketing sites. Now, what you're probably more familiar with are your H tags. So I always like to have an H1, an H2, an H3, an H4, an H5, and an H6. You can go to H8s depending on the need of your brand, but I personally like to keep it with 6 just because it keeps things nice and clean. And depending on your brand, these range from sizes from 20 to 72, so 20 at H6 all the way to 72 or higher for H1. Again, font is so brand specific where I'm not going to go into it that much. Now, in terms of your H tags and your hero, I always like to apply a text headings color token associated with them. So that would be a text headings. So you can have all of your font in one color, but I like to separate out my text headings from my text body, which we'll look at in just a second, just because I can make my text body slightly lighter to draw more attention to those headings themselves. So again, within your H tags and all of your font, you're going to need your font color, your font weight, your font style, your line height, your paragraph spacing. Those are all design tokens that are associated with your headings and also your paragraphs as well. Speaking of paragraphs, let's move all the way down here. So these are what I like to call text body. So these are our body copies. So let me move this out of the way. But by body, text body, I mean text paragraph. I just like to use the naming convention as body. Okay, just want to clear that up so there's no confusion. So what this is, you would have a paragraph large. So a paragraph large would be a great example of text that might sit on a card, but it's not necessarily explaining anything. So you can almost look at it like a subtitle or sub caption associated with a heading. So generally, I like to keep that set to 20. You would then move into your paragraph. Now, this is if you're reading an article, if you write a blog post, this is the size of that copy, which I generally set to 16. Anything below 16 is you tend to need to be pretty careful in terms of accessibility, both of the font weight, the font style. There's a whole bunch of other things that you need to look for, but 16 is really the baseline where any type of font will work and still pass accessibility standards. I also always like to have in my back pocket a paragraph small, tends to be 14, and then a caption size that I really need to set at 12. So those are some of the common design tokens, both at the H tags, the hero, but also the paragraphs that I like to include in my design system. But again, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the design tokens that go into these a little bit later on. Next, let's go ahead and look at our radiuses. So in terms of your radiuses, this is totally brand specific. You can only have if you only have one radius, you can have one radius. If you have use cases for 10 radiuses, you can have 10 radiuses. It doesn't really matter. So I always like to start off with a radius of none. So you have those nice crisp square edges. A radius of small, which tends to be 2. I don't really like having radiuses that are odd numbers, but again, if your brand calls for it, so be it. You then have radiuses of 4 and then radiuses of 8. And then in your back pocket, you always like to have a round radius. So if your buttons are round or you need like a pill shape think about like a selectable tag or interactive tag, it's always nice to have those nice and rounded. So having one that's a 50 in your back pocket always works. So those are just some of the design tokens that I like to have with my radius. Next, let's go ahead and look at our border widths. You, of course, are also going to need border width design tokens. Now, Just a couple that you might need. Again, this can totally vary based on your brand and how many you need and what are the use cases. But again, if you're just getting started, 4 is always a good number. So you're going to need a value of 0 if you don't have a value that you're going to need. So no border width on this component. A small value of 1. So unlike working with your radiuses, I actually always do like to have a value of 1 just in case you need a very slight border width around a component. A small of 2. This might come in handy if you have larger components like cards or modals. And then 4 as well. Again, same use case, likely come in handy with larger components, whether it's a card, a modal, a sign up, pop up, whatever it is. So those are 4 that I like to start with. Again, just when I'm just getting started. You can always add more as your brand requires it. In terms of building out your variables or your design tokens within Figma or also Token Studio, if you still use Token Studio, there's a couple different ways that you can do that. Now, in a lot of the videos that I've done to date, I've covered that in the past, some of the different types of approaches, whether it's a 3-tier approach or a 2-tiered approach. But let's review those together and then look at a couple examples as to how we can bring variables from the first collection all the way down to the last collection, whether you're using the 3-tiered approach or the tiered approach. Let's start off with the approach that I use most for the design system clients that I work with, which is called the 3-tiered approach to design token architecture, which leverages a brand collection, an alias collection, and also a mapped collection. Now, your brand collection is sort of the foundation to all of your variables, and you can kind of look at it like it's the trunk of a tree. And again, I know I've used this example in the past, so if this is repetitive, sorry. So your brand collection here in purple would be all of your variables in their purest form, whether it's just the individual numbers or border widths or even like scales for things like font size, that you can also include that in there as well. But it predominantly is really just hex codes for your colors. So they haven't been assigned any role yet. It's really just hex codes in their purest form. So FFFFF, AB, 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 that we haven't really categorize them yet into primary or what their specific role is. It's just grays and a bunch of hex codes, blues and a bunch of hex codes. And we're going to look at a quick example of this very shortly. From your brand, it then goes into your alias collection. And your alias collection is kind of like a trunk of a tree because it sort of connects the variables in their purest form to everything that is seen or what your designers consume, which would be leaves. So this is where you might be taking your red scale and defining it the role of air. So if your brand is also red, maybe you have 2 slightly different shades of red. Which one is for your air and which one is for your brand? Which one is your primary red versus your air? This is where you're kind of defining the individual roles that all of these colors are going to have, these color scales. So your red would become your airs. Your blues would become your informations. Your greens would become your success. But you don't know the specific role that plays into just yet. And that's where your mapped collection actually comes into play. And again, we're going to cover an example of this very shortly, so stay tuned. So your mapped collection is where you take some of the colors, but not always all of the colors in your alias collection, and give them a specific role. So what's my text air? What's my text information? What's my text body? What's my text heading? It's really important to note here that you do not need a specific role for every color that is in your alias or every color that is in your brand, because that's going to overcomplicate things. Think about maybe you have with your brand a color scale with 50 different red colors. You might actually only be using 4 of those colors in a production environment. So that's why in your mapped collection, you're really only pulling in the colors that you need for those specific roles. And that's a quick introduction into the 3-tiered approach. And we're going to look at the 2-tiered approach next before we look at examples as to how these would work in the context of Figma variables. Okay, so next is your primitive semantic collection. So it's only 2 collections for your design tokens or your Figma variables. Instead of 3. And this is a pretty common approach if you're just getting started. The 3-tier approach is a little bit more complex and is what a lot of large enterprises tend to use who are pretty mature in their design system. There's a bunch of reasons why your 3-tier approach is recommended for more complex design systems than your 2-tier approach, but we're not going to get into that right now. But your 2-tier approach, leveraging just your primitive and your semantic collection, is one that's pretty common across a lot of libraries out there like Untitled UI. Even Figma uses the primitive semantic collection as well, where the only key difference is you're just eliminating the brand collection. What you're saying is you already know what your primary error, warning, and success colors are, and then you take those right into your semantic collection, also known as like what could be known as your mapped collection, whereas all those individual roles for those design tokens, so your text tokens, your icon tokens, surface, border tokens, variables, whatever, those would be inside of your semantic collection. So again, eliminating the brand collection and skipping really right to the alias collection is a great way to look at your primitive and semantic collection. So let's look at a quick example as to how we can take a color from the first collection, or a color scale from the first collection in both of these examples through to the final collection. Okay, so let's get started with a quick example as to how we can take a color from our brand collection all the way through to our mapped collection. So what we have here is just a basic color scale, a green color scale. And again, we're going to do this for the primitive semantic approach after. So what I have here is just 3 collections: our brand collection, our alias collection, and then our mapped collection. So starting off in our brand collection, so we're not really assigning a role to this color scale just yet, even though, sneak peek, we know it's going to be success. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to put green and then group this with a 100. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can name your colors. I prefer to use the 100 scale. So what this essentially allows me to do is give each color a specific number. So 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. And this is a really great starting point because you already have a base scale. You can assign those 100 values to that base scale themselves. So just color match here. It's not going to be the best looking scale. Our 300, and then our 400, our 500. Where's our 500? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7. Oops, one too many, so let me delete that one. 500, 600, and then our 700. So if this here is our 600, and then this here is going to be our 700. I think I did that right. Yeah, something like that works. And the reason why your 100 scale is so nice, because if you need to add a color in between, so these two, your 4 and your 5 seem pretty far apart, is you can call it 450, and then find another color that's kind of in between these two shades right here. So it's a great way to scale up your scale over time using the 100 scales, because you can even get like pretty finite between like a 425, a 410, depending on the needs of your scale. So again, if you already have a base color scale, you can set all those values to the 100 values. And then if you need to add more colors in between scales, you can set those to the 50 in between, like a 150 or a 350. Again, sometimes this can be a pretty confusing concept. So again, if you have any questions, ask on our community forum, leave comments down below. Let's now go ahead and look at our alias collection next. Okay, so now that we have our brand, let's go into our alias collection and create a new grouping that's going to be our success. So our success, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then our 700. And what we're doing is really just connecting our alias to our brand. So essentially what we've done in our brand is we've labeled these as just our green, and then our alias, we're defining these as our individual success. So one thing that's great about the alias collection is I can actually add different brands in my alias and then have different light dark themes in my mapped collection. And that's generally how I tend to handle multi-brand and dark and light. So I'm going to go ahead and create the alias and just connect it into our brand collection itself. So our 100, our 200, our 300, our 400, our 500, our 600, and then also our 700 itself. So it's really that simple in the grand scheme of things. Going from your brand to your alias is you're really just duplicating the same, but assigning it a specific role. Now, in terms of the mapped collection, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to break out some different groupings. So we're going to have like a text success. We're also going to have a icon success. Oops, not in text. Let's delete that. Delete that variable. We're then going to have a icon success. An icon success. We're also then going to have a border success. Again, thinking back to the beginning of the video when we were working with the alerts, what are some of those success colors? And then we're lastly going to need a surface success. So one thing that's important to note here is if these are the only success colors that I need, there's really no need for all 7 variables or design tokens in this case brought into the mapped collection. And this is a big mistake that designers tend to make, is they tend to think they need roles for every single color. Then all of a sudden your designs look all over the place because you have 50 different shades of green. Okay, so that's what we want to avoid. So in terms of our text success, what I'm going to do is connect these back to our alias, choose one like a 500. Maybe I want the same for our icon, so there's some consistency between our text and our icon. For our border, maybe I want like a really darker shade. And for our surface, maybe I want a really lighter shade. Oops, and I connected that to the wrong one. So always be sure to leverage your alias when connecting from your mapped. So there we go. So basically just whatever the roles are that I need for my success, just taking these from your mapped collection and then applying here. And again, you don't need to make use of every single one of every single color in your scales for your mapped collection. So next, let's go ahead and look at our primitive in Semantic. So we still have our alias brand and maps. So we're going to come back to that probably a little bit later on. But let's focus on our primitives for now. So our primitives are really just skipping the brand and really just calling this just success. So success 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 200, or 300, or 400, our 500, our 600, and then our 700. And let's just simply connect this out. So our 700, our 600, our 500, our 400, our 300, our 200. And then what we have here is our 100. And then let's create a new collection. Actually, but before we do that, one thing I'd still like to cover is what if you have multiple shades of green? What you'd then end up having to do, let's just duplicate this group and just call this green and say these shades of green were slightly different. So you'd have your success, but then you'd also have your green for all the colors that are a part of that success scale. So that's where there can be some confusion with your primitive collections because it's a mix of your alias and your brand. You'd have success and you'd also have green. And you might have, green light, green dark, depending on the different scales. And things can get pretty confusing. And having your alias collection just really cleans that up. So next, let's go ahead and create our semantic collection. Semantic collection. Actually, what we can even just do, actually, no, I won't duplicate the maps. Semantic. With our semantic, this is where we're going to create a variable for our icon success. We're going to have a text success. We're also going to have a surface success. And then we're also going to have a border success. Border success, we're just tying it back from our primitives. So let's create the alias of that. Look for our primitive. Again, you're not going to have all these other collections if you're leveraging a 2-tier. Where is our primitives? So icon, maybe the 500. Our text, also the 500. Look for your primitive. Primitives, yeah, our 500. Our surface might be the lighter one. Surface and your primitives might be the 100 and your border might be darker. I forget what we added on, but maybe that is the 600. So something like that. So your primitive is semantic. Your primitive is really just a combination of your brand and alias. Again, depending on the use case. If you only have one shade of green, it really is just skipping right to your alias. But if you have multiples, it's a combination of like success of your brand and alias. And your semantic is really just very similar to your mapped collection in the grand scheme of things. So next, let's go ahead and look at where we might add light and dark mode into this. So I changed my mind. We're not going to get to dark mode just yet. We're going to cover just brand at a high level and alias at a high level. So I've actually gone ahead, taken the liberty of building out our brand and our alias that we're going to review. And then we're going to look at our map together. But instead of just having to have you watch me, select colors and color match based off color scales here on the left, I've taken the liberty of doing that. So you don't have to watch me do it. But if you do want to go slow, follow along with me while I do it. I would watch Build a Design System Series episode 1, and we go through this nice and slow together. So a couple things to note here. In our brand collection, you'll see we have our greens, our reds, our purples. Again, UI Collective, we have a purple, our grays, our blues, and our oranges. Now, one thing I would like to call out is in your grays, you'll notice I have white and black here. A lot of designers choose to keep this within your gray, but not assign it a specific value because they're kind of just numbers. They're kind of just colors on their own or shades on their own, white and black. But a lot of designers also choose not to put that inside of the gray grouping and just leave them in the all variables alone. So they're like not grouped. That's also an approach. So then within our alias collection here, so again, we have our primary, our UI collective color is purple. So that's going to be our primary. If we're our secondary, in this case, we had our secondary, so pink, you would have your secondary grouping here as well. So we have our success, our error, and our neutral. So this is what we call our gray. These are our neutral values. And you'll notice here I also connected it to white and black. Not really mandatory because these colors are really not going to change, but I just did it anyway, just for best practice purposes. And then we have our information, and then we also have our warning here. So let's go ahead and look at our mapped collection next. Okay, so here we are within our mapped collection, and let's go through and go build out our text, our border, our icon, our surface together. Now, one thing I've done here is I've gone through and built out all the namings that we need already, just so I don't need to keep looking to my cheat sheet, because sometimes I do even get mixed up with this, with all the ones that we would need. So just to avoid any mistakes here. So starting with our text. Now, your text is kind of funny. So because I have, or for our copy, excuse me, you'll recall back, we have our hero, our headings, our body, and our caption. What I like to do is I always like to have, personally myself, my hero and my headings combined within my headings. So just would be one variable. It simplifies things. And then put my caption, anything else within my body. So that's my approach, is just have two, your headings and your body. But a lot of designers, again, depending on your brand and the look that you're going for, you might have 4 different body design tokens. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's go into our neutral then, and let's tie these back. If I spelled neutral wrong, let's go back and fix that. Neutral, there we go. There we go. So let's go back into our mapped and just connect this into our neutral. So our neutral, let's say it's maybe our hero will be the black, our headings will be the 700, our body will be the 600, and maybe our caption will be the 500, something like that. And again, all these colors here, this is just an example. This is not going to produce the best looking design system in the world. So I would suggest using the colors within your own color scale. Next, let's look at text action. So your text action, I don't know if I covered it earlier, but this would be just like a link itself. Sorry, let me move that out of the way. Let's just add in just some text where it's just link. So, and if I set that to, where's our UI collective purple? Sorry, I got too many windows here. I'm not going to do that. So your action would really just be your purple. So the main color associated with your button. So whatever your surface action is, think about it like if you have a hyperlink, what's that color? That's your action. So let's create the alias of that and look for our primary and set that to like our 600. Or maybe we'll go 500, and then your action hover. So if this link is hovered, what's the color that's going to happen? Again, usually just a slightly different, darker shade of your primary. So your link as it stands is 500. When it's hovered to show that it's clickable, it's 600. Let's then go with a warning. So let's look for our warning. Now, one thing I tend to do with my warnings, success warnings, errors, so on and so forth, is I tend to keep the 100 value relatively similar across all of them. So all the text might share 500. All the borders might share 600. So in this case, let's go into our warning, look for the warning 500, and we're to assign that. Let's then look for our error 500, and then our on actions, you recall that these are white. So our neutral, our whites, and then our on disable tends to be a little bit darker. Just thinking about the example we had earlier, maybe that's 500. And one thing I realized here is we don't have our text disabled. So excuse me. And again, if I forgot any variables here, just feel free to leave a comment below, and apologies in advance. So there we go. I think we're looking pretty good. So our text connects back to our neutrals. We have our actions, our success, warning, error, on action, on disabled, and then our disabled. Perfect. So let's go into our borders itself. So again, we need a border primary, and this is going to connect back to our neutral too. If we wanted sort of that thin border, we're going to set that to like our light border 200, and then keep our information border will be the information 600, our warning 600, our error 600, our disabled. So it's the color of our disabled button. Maybe we'll go with a neutral 500. And again, when you're doing this, you never want to do this without having examples of your designs to look at. I'm a rule breaker, so I'm not doing it in this case. But whenever you're doing this, you want to have designs to look at to build out your design token library, Figma variables accordingly. Our border on disabled, maybe we want that a little bit darker. So maybe like a neutral 600. Our border actions, so you recall that's going to be our primary 500, our action hover, our primary 600, thinking back to what we did for our text. And then our focus, if you're not familiar with the focus state, I would maybe watch some of our other videos, but I'm not going to go into that right now. And that tends to be our primary 500, so whatever that action is. Perfect. So we have our borders. Next, let's go ahead and look at our icons. So we always like to have a color of our primary icon. This tends to be the same shade that we set for our body as well. So in this case, is our neutral 600. So our icon primary is also going to be neutral 600. Think about if you have text and an icon side by side, you want some similarities between the two. Or maybe you don't. It's your design system. Let's then go ahead and look at our information. So this is going to be our information 500. This then is going to be our error 500. Again, keeping that level of consistency. This then is going to be our warning 500. We have our icon actions. So think about purple. So our primary 500, our action hover. Again, keeping some consistency with our actions and our action hover. 600, our icon on action. What do we have? That will be the white. So let me connect our neutral, our white, and then our on disabled. What do we put for on disabled? Our neutral 500. We're going to keep that consistent as well. Neutral 500. There we go. And lastly, let's go ahead and look at our surface. And again, if I'm going too quick here, I do go through this a little bit slower in our Build a Design System series, episode 1. So be sure to check that out. So I'll put our page first. So our surface page in this case might be our neutral white. Our surface primary, maybe we want like a little slightly darker shade for all our cards. And maybe our cards might have a lighter shade of purple. So maybe I'm going to set this to our primary 100. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily need to be the neutrals for your primary, whatever color you want for like your cards, so on and so forth. Our surface disabled. Let's create an alias of that. And again, I'm just sort of spitballing here. Maybe we want this like a 100, nice and light. And then our on disabled, maybe a little bit darker. Neutral, maybe like 200. Our surface error, and your surface errors tends to be the lightest color in your shades. Again, depending on in your scales, again, depending on sort of look that you're going for. But I always like to have it set to my lightest, because then that darker text will stand out a little bit more. So our information 100, our surface action, so our primary 500, and then our action hover will be our primary 600. And your action hover too, this is something I didn't talk about earlier, but I'm going to introduce it now. It can be a lighter shade of your action hover. So if you're on a darker background and you want your action to get a little bit lighter, your action hover 2 covers that. So in this case, it's going to be like a primary like 400. So just something to have in your wheelhouse. Perfect. So now we've successfully built out our brand, our alias, and then also our mapped collection. Next, let's go ahead and look at some of the other design tokens that will go inside of these collections before looking at how we might introduce another brand, but also light and dark mode as well, and some of the logistics surrounding that. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and look at some of the other variables that go inside of our brand collection, specifically relating to type. It has nothing to do with like the values of our type with the size of the line heights. We're going to get to that next, but just to cover this at a high level, sorry, let me move that window out of the way. Let's go ahead and create a string variable that we're going to call type. And then a grouping that's going to be called fonts family to start. And we're going to start off with our headings. Now, I like to group your font families based off what goes with your headings in your body. You can also do with a hero and a caption as well. That's my preferred approach because it matches what's in the map collection. Now, we're not going to be bringing their font family, what's going to be our font weight, into our alias, into our map, because there's really no need to. Those values aren't going to change. It's so rare for you to change your font families and your font weights and like do any of the mapping associated with it. It's really not needed. So we're only going to leave these inside of our brand collection. So for our headings, what we're going to do is just set this to enter, to Roboto. Sorry, we should put our hero all the way up. And then our caption might also just be enter. So this is the family of our font itself. Now, one thing we also need to do is look at our font weight. So our font weights, and this is why it's really important to actually pay attention to the font weights that are in the fonts that you've selected in your font family. Because enter has, regular, medium, semi-bold, bold, extra bold, black, but Roboto might not have black. So if you assign a variable of black to Roboto, Figma's not going to know what to do. So that's why it's really important to pay attention to what types of font weights your font families that you're using for your brand actually have. So what we're going to do is actually cover just regular to start. Font weights, regular. There we go. Regular, semi-bold. So these to match the naming that's inside of that font family, bold, and then bold for now. So that's just some of the other variables that go inside of a brand collection. We're not done with our brand collection yet, as we still do need to add in a quick scale. Okay, so there's a couple other groups of variables that need to go inside of this. One of which, and again, I've gotten a lot of pushback from designers and also clients I work with as well around the simplest way to do it. I've covered it in different methods in the past, but the simplest version being this is more of an introductory video to design tokens and getting you comfortable, not necessarily the more complex example, is really just to put this inside, I mean your border width and your border radius inside of your brand collection. But I want to cover an issue that you might encounter when going through that. So if we just put our border widths in here, border widths, set this to 0, or border widths, none, because again, thinking back to our token, so none, this would be 0. We might have a small, which would be 1. We might have a medium, that's 2, 1, 2, and we might have, a large, that's 4 for border widths. And if I was to duplicate this group for your border radius, you might have a none, you might have a small, that's 2, you might have a medium, that's 4, you might have a large, that's 8, and then you might have a round that's set to 50, okay? So we have our border widths and our border radiuses in our brand collection, but an issue with this is, skipping ahead here, is we need to add additional brands. We do that inside the alias level itself. So this would be brand 1, brand 1, brand 1, and then this would be brand 2. So by putting your border widths and your border radiuses inside your brand collection is now all of a sudden you no longer really have the ability to add an additional brand. It really just overcomplicates things if your border widths and border radiuses are going to change between brands. So what we actually like to do to counteract that is we like to put our border widths and our border aliases inside of our aliases. Now, there's a catch here. So border width, border width, none. And then what do we have here? We had if I go back to our brand, our border widths, we had none, small, medium, large. We had none, small, medium, and then our large. This was 1, 2, 4 accordingly. And then with our border groups, let me go back. So that we had our border radius. Border radius, we had none, small, large, and then round. But the issue with this is we still need to connect that back to our brand collection if these values ever need to change. So what we actually like to do inside of our brand collection is, if I was going to delete these for now, is we like to build one long scale, but all the numbers that we need for things like spacing, border width, and border radiuses will actually pull from. So let's take a look at that next. Okay, so we're approaching the end of our design token setup. So let's go into our brand collection as we are right now, and let's create a scale. Now, a scale is come in handy because whatever values that we need inside of our design system tie back to the scale. The benefit of this is it stops designers from just using like random numbers that they think looks good with their design, but doesn't follow a particular pattern. Because technically, any value that's used is compatible with your brand, but it's up to your documentation to specify which values are associated with what. So it's why documentation is super important with your design system. So inside of our brand collection, we're just going to create a scale. So a number scale, we're just going to call this scale, and we're going to start off with 0. Because again, we might need a 0 value. Now, in terms of this, I like to use a 4-pixel grid. So all the way up to all the values that I might need. And sort of the max for that would be what's the largest space that you might need on a card? What's the largest padding? So again, when you're building out your scale, it's super important for you to understand what your designs look like, or else your scale is going to be inaccurate. So whatever the largest value is, it generally, is it 256? Is it 312? The largest space that's inside of your designs tends to be with the largest value in your scale. We're not looking at like max widths for things like frames and larger cards here. I tend not to like to include those because those can change based on the design in the dashboard. Maybe you might add a little bit more padding, a little bit more gap between elements. So what your scale is really referring to is in terms of just spacing, not widths, not heights, and also ties into your radiuses and your width and your border widths as well. When I say not widths, I mean not like design widths. So we're going to start with 0, and then we're going to go with a 100 here. So I like to follow a 4-pixel grid and start with the 4. Now, I know from our border widths and our radiuses, we like to have a 2 value, which in this case will be our 50. Again, leveraging the same 100 scale methodology for our scale. And then we're also going to have a 25, which is going to be set to 1. And I like to build out this scale all the way up to, again, sort of the highest value that I tend to use. And you don't need to go every multiple of 4. So 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 28, 32, all the way up, because that can take, large chunks of time and have one massive long scale. So what you can do once you get to a certain point is I'll show you. So like 200 would be our 8, again, following that scale. 300 would be our 12. 400 would be our 16. 500 can be our 20. 600 can be our 24. 700 could be our 28. 800 could be our 32, and maybe 32 for some of our smaller components. That's the smallest size that we might get. And then all of a sudden we can duplicate it. So 900 to 64. So then we're moving into more like hard spacing and all that stuff. So it's really up to you in terms of how you want to set this up. So I'm going to pause here. And if you have any questions on building out your scale, just feel free to leave some comments below. Or if you're looking for more enterprise help or more coaching, we do have some offers available for that. So check out the Design System Labs link. So next what we're going to do is look at responsive designs. But actually, before we get to responsive designs, let's look at where we might add light and dark mode and also additional brands. So it's a question I get all the time as to where do I add like different brands in light and dark mode, right? So I believe I already mentioned it, which I already did. So I tend to add different brands at the alias level. And then what I tend to do is in mapped is actually where I add my light and dark mode. My light and dark modes here. Now, another question that I get when designers are trying to build out their dark mode token library is how do I know what colors to pick? And the best place to start is whatever your light mode colors are, just simply inverse them. So your primary 100 on light, this would be your primary 700 on dark. Your page with neutral white, what's your darkest? Your black. Your neutral 100 here, your neutral 700, your success 100 would be your success 700. So you're really just inversing all the colors. So where on light, let's think of a button, you'd have white text on a dark colored background. On dark mode, you'd have light text on a lighter background. So those are just some of the things that I like to do. They're not what I like to do. What's more common practice when starting to set up your dark mode is really just inverse all those colors. And then once you have a visual of what your dark mode looks like, you can go back and then adjust. So maybe you might want success 700 to be success 600, because then you alleviate some concerns maybe with accessibility. I don't know. So in terms of different brands, again, at your alias level and light and dark mode at your maps level. Now, you're probably asking, Kirk, what if I need, responsive, text sizes depending on the device size that I'm on. So you want a hero or an H6 or an H1 to be one size on desktop, another on tablet, another on mobile. And that's what we're going to look at, a responsive collection next. Okay, so where do you handle your text sizes and everything associated with that? And we're actually going to introduce a new collection, and I'm not going to build this out entirely. It'll probably take me an hour and a half to do right now, but I'll leave a link in the description where you can go watch how we would build this out in full. So we're going to introduce a collection that we're going to call our responsive collection. And inside your responsive collection are going to be a bunch of number variables associated with things like your font and also your spacing as well. So as an example, we might have our line height for our body, and then we might have our line height for our headings. So for your body, and then this is where you would introduce things like for your H6, your H5, your H4, your H3, and then your H2, and then your H1. So in our body, you might have, a paragraph, large. Our body, you might have a paragraph large. Oops, I did that twice. Our body, paragraph large, paragraph small, and then just a basic paragraph. And you might also fit your caption in here as well. And then your caption in here as well. And then you'd also do the same thing. One thing I forgot to add in here is your hero. And you do the same thing then. Let me duplicate this for your font size. So this would be your font size. So you do really the exact same for your font size. And then also duplicate this group for your paragraph spacing. for your paragraph spacing. And what this is going to allow you to do, and again, I'm not going to do this now, but I do have a video on that, is it allows you then to specify what sizes are what on desktop, on tablet, and then also on mobile as well. So in terms of my fonts, one thing I used to do is I used to try to fit these within our mats collection. It's got too complex. I got feedback from a ton of designers. It's not the best way to handle your design tokens. So instead, I introduced this responsive collection, and everyone seems to like this much, much more. Now, in terms of spacing as well, think about components like a card, or if you have like an accordion, that spacing might also be different depending on the device size as well. So the one thing I also do is I also introduce this spacing collection. Let me just confirm something here so I don't mix things up. With your spacing collection, and what you can also do. Sorry, where's my all variables? So spacing, you can set this to your 100 and then define the different spaces that you would have for desktop, tablet, and mobile. I tend not to do this at the component level. I tend to keep it more overall. But again, I would take a quick look at a responsive design token video, and that will go a little bit more in depth on that. I'm not going to cover that right now. So that's a high level overview of your responsive collection and where you can put the sizes for your desktops, your tablets, and your mobile for your font, and also for your spacing as well.